Welcome to the Apologetics.com radio show, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. My name is Harry Edwards, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. And joining me in the studio are Lenny Esposito and Dr. Jacob Daniel. And we have lots of stuff to talk about this evening. Right?
Oh, my.
I know.
It's a slow news week, you know.
Yeah, I was mentioning to you guys earlier that for any originalists out there, and I'm talking about the U.S. Constitution originalists, this has been a good couple weeks. My goodness, right? This is, to be honest, I mean, I'm no expert on this, but I don't remember any other period in the last few decades, I think, where you've had a lot of good things happening in like 10 days, I think.
Yeah.
You know, one is the education in Maine, where apparently it's okay to use government funds and use them toward Christian schooling.
To not bias Christian schooling.
It's not biased, yeah. It's all up to the parents.
Funding.
It's the parents' decision.
Now, Harry, you always ask me, what's the reason behind my optimism?
Yes.
This is it.
It's getting there, yeah. No, we're going to talk about the cracks in the third world. We'll flesh that out later. But the other thing is the whole Second Amendment got upheld in New York, right? Yep. And then, of course, what just happened today?
Yeah.
Overturning
Dobbs
of Roe v.
versus Jackson. In the overturning of Roe v. Wade and Casey versus Ferguson, which is huge.
Yeah.
That is a landmark decision that makes and it doesn't ban abortion by any stretch of the imagination. It is, as one commentator said, it is the end of the beginning of the fight. And now it goes it gets to put back the arguments get put back into play, is what I said earlier. The arguments are now in play, and you get to engage them. You can't just have somebody say, well, it's the law of the land, and shut you down that way, because that's no longer true.
Right. But to me also, it communicates and signals a very valuable thing that we have here, and that is that life is indeed valuable.
It's not something it's not found in the Constitution as you have the right to deprive a life.
It's not a right.
Basically, it says that the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And so that's always interesting, right? About just how people view rights. It's almost like what is a right, you know? And in today's understanding, almost every advantage that one can get is a right. And
Constitution does not confer right.
That's
a good statement.
That's right.
It recognizes the right.
Yes.
Right? Given ultimately by God.
That's
right.
But
Harry, I have to read this. I mean, for me, this was a moment to just remember Chesterton's statement. He said this, at least 5 times the fate has to all appearances gone to the dogs. In each of these 5 cases, it was a dog that died.
That's great.
This is an evidence of one of the dogs dying.
Yeah. And the practical outcome is actually fascinating. They think that practically the ruling will immediately depress abortions between 13 to 15%. So, for example, all 3 abortion clinics in the state of Louisiana have closed.
Oh, wow.
Texas abortion clinics have closed. I believe Oklahoma abortion clinics are now closing. And this is telling on a number of levels. It's because the states had laws that were in suspension until the court ruling came out. Now that the court ruling came out,
they had trigger laws.
They had trigger laws that came in. Yeah. But the other question is, if you remember the rhetoric of Planned Parenthood, they would say, oh, well, only 3% of our budget really comes from abortion services. So why are you closing all these clinics then? What exactly was the percentage of your...
I know.
Because they would subdivide the procedure from every aspect other than that, and they would play with the numbers. So reality is a cruel taskmaster, and when it shows up, all of a sudden you've actually got to deal with it. But it's amazing that babies are going to be alive now because of these decisions.
But we also need to remember that 90% of the abortions are done before 13 weeks of pregnancy, half of which is done by using pills.
Yes. The so-called what is it? The post
The
conception.
RU, whatever.
RU 486. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's basically meant for
morning after
pill. That was
pill.
the word I was thinking.
And there's a pill that's used for basically when miscarriages happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You know, what I learned just listening to a lot of news outlets today is apparently even the United States, even with its conservatism, is actually an outlier when it comes to abortion. Apparently, we are barbaric compared to some of the more progressive nations out there where abortions after the second trimester are just banned, you know.
Well, many of the countries in Europe that we compare ourselves to in other aspects
that are socialists
after 15 weeks.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
So Sweden and nations
wow.
of that nature, after 15 weeks, no, you don't have abortions. They're illegal.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking about some of these things, what Rife is calling death works, and Rife is also calling breaks in the third world cultures. So we'll flesh that out in just a moment. But if you're following along, we are discussing the second chapter of Carl Trueman's book, what's the title again, gentlemen? The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Yeah. So it's a cultural analysis of where we are currently, and as cultural apologists, it is our duty to understand culture, because it's only by doing that are we able to communicate the gospel, and I am convinced of that. So now God can do anything so long as it's not contrary to his nature, and he can have talking donkeys present the gospel, right? But I believe God has given us wisdom in order to communicate the gospel in these times. Again, it's kind of like what Paul did in Acts 17. We need to, the message doesn't change, but the medium certainly, the method certainly can change. So, gentlemen, before I go on, I just want to remind our listeners that we are totally supported by your generous donations. And if you find our shows valuable and wish to see it continue, please support us by liking and sharing this on YouTube, on your Facebook channels, Twitter, and other social media outlets. And you can also help us with our radio costs by going to our website, which is www.apologetics.com, and click on that donate button. And any amount helps, and your partnership will help us remain on the air. We have a certificate program there. If some of these things turn you on, like you get really interested by these things, you think it's going to help your faith tremendously, I would recommend that you check out our fully online certificate program. And I always want to ask you guys, how are the ministries that you're involved with? Let's start with Lenny. How's Come Reason? What's going on?
It's going well. We've been doing an Instagram campaign last couple of months that's been reaching a lot of people, doing a lot of different reels and things, and also leading to various discussions with various people of differing opinions, shall we say. So that's always interesting and always fun. And I've got a couple of good teaching opportunities coming up. I'm getting ready to prep a lesson for July 10th that's entitled, "What Does It Mean to Be a Human Being?" What is a human? Because people are just confused about.
We'll definitely talk about that tonight.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. Yeah.
So and within the cultural context as well. But it's going to be a fun time. So just plugging along, getting that stuff done, getting, as you also know, into the fundraising mindset for the fall and things of that nature. Yes.
And may I ask what's the status of your book deal? What's going on with that?
It's still it's as it was, so it's still coming along, but hopefully we'll get that wrapped up fairly soon. So
seems like Marvel is coming out with a movie every other month.
Nowadays. But man, there's been a shift in the way that they've portrayed a lot of things. The last Doctor Strange film is decidedly not only darker, but different in its moral context. It is more third world, which is
interesting.
And superhero movies tended to be very second world in their approach. They're very externally morally driven, and we're starting to lose some of that, which is fascinating to me, even in our culture. So we see like the rise of the anti-hero across society as well, where people are just a moral guide within themselves.
It is disappointing, but we shouldn't be surprised, because when Marvel got bought by Disney, right, and not too long ago, Disney announced that every show they make, or 50% of all the shows they make, will have an LGBT flavor in it. That's what they said. So
well, and they're caving to. I mean, they've just announced today that they will pay for their employees to travel to get abortions.
Wow!
As a response to Roe v. Wade, which for a company who's built on the backs of children and family entertainment, that's a bizarre, self-defeating stance. So
this only shows that no one's neutral when it comes to issues concerning morality.
Absolutely.
What about you, Jacob? How's everything
It's been
at Heritage Council?
Going well. It's been a busy season, and since we finished our conference, I spoke on the very question of what does it mean to be a person, the longing for dignity at a few other gatherings and conferences, and I'm also contributing on one of the podcasts under Fight, Laugh, Feast Network. It's called Water Break. Basically, the idea is to somehow generate an alternative media, and that would take more of a biblical standpoint when it comes to what's happening in our culture.
Okay.
So, I'm really excited to be part of that, and it's always a joy to be here and to be speaking on things that matter.
And the best part is fellowshipping at Acapulco an hour before the show, with Lenny with his one scoop of vanilla ice cream. And, we tell the servers now, they know what Lenny wants.
That's right.
So let's get into this again. The second chapter of Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And again, we would encourage you, if you're listening, pick up this book. It might be rough reading in the beginning, but I think it's well worth it. And if anything, you get introduced to a lot of these terms.
Now, if you want a little bit, Carl Trueman did recently release a kind of condensed version of the book that's not quite as academic, called Strange New Worlds.
Oh, there you go.
So you can pick up Strange New Worlds if you're interested in the ideas and get an overview. A lot more of the detail is in this book. This was his first book, but just FYI, that's available as well.
And the title of this chapter is Reimagining Our Culture. So if you've been listening to us, at least the last Saturday of each month when we do the show, a lot of the emphases of our shows are on cultural apologetics. And so this whole title is not even very strange, right? Imagining our culture. And culture is just simply defined as what human beings make of the world. That's Andy Crouch's definition. I'd like to add to that, if I can, with all due respect, right? It's what human beings make in the world as well. And it's really nothing fancy. Culture is just what we make, and the make part is we create values, whether it's good or bad. We create things. We make movies. We write stories, and we do our 9-to-5 jobs. So in a way, we are creators, just like since we are created in God's image. God is a creator, and his image bearers are creators as well, and that becomes culture. Like a good analogy that's very helpful, somebody mentioned, let's say grapes would be God's creation. We make it into wine. That's culture, So that's kind of a good analogy. You have God's creation, and then what we make out of God's creation is culture. Philip Reif now came up with these 3 terms that are related to culture. And
Philip Reif was a popular sociologist in the mid 20th century. He wrote these. He came up with these ideas about 1960s, I think, is when he first published through them. So and he's the one who saw these mass movements of society going from, and I think we talked about this last time, from the polis to the the political man, to the religious man, to the economic man, and now to the psychological man. Those were his kind of broad movements of how societies and civilization has changed. And so what he's now looking at is how these societies base their understanding of morality and the rights and the wrongs that they have to agree to, right? So Reif says the social order, that which embodies society's moral values, is the essence of civilization. And used to be, or for most societies, it was that the social order was always grounded in the sacred order, whatever that sacred order would be.
Right. And he talks about the three worlds, right? The first world, the second world, and the third world. And it's just important to make the distinction that these are not the economic or geographic locations of countries, or what now we call, for the third world, developing nations. This
completely
is Philip
different.
Reif's own matrix, and he calls them first, second, and third world. And so now we want to talk about those things just to help you understand where he's getting some of these ideas. So first world would be, how would you characterize a first world culture?
The first world would be the pagan world. Just one of the examples I would give is that there was a pagan world in Europe before Christianity. And the second world would be the Christian world, just like there was a Christianity before America. However, what we are seeing now is more of societies evolving into more of a secular society. And that's what Reif connects with the third world.
Yeah, third world culture.
Third world culture.
Yeah. So he says the first world culture is a world that is governed by fates or myths. If you think about the ancient Greeks, right? It's whatever the gods will is what the gods will is, and we can't get the oracle at Delphi said X.
Yeah.
So therefore we have to go to war. Oh, that would be a first world understanding, is we follow our lives, but our lives are actually dictated by the gods or by
There's
the
still
fates.
a transcendent order.
But we all agree that there is a God or
right.
gods out there, and that's what we follow. The second world order is faith-based, as you say. It becomes our morality is, are we being faithful, veridical? Are we being properly appropriating the teachings of God? So it's a little different because we have choices, right? In Christianity, you aren't forced to do something. You can choose to believe. You can choose to not steal or to steal. You have a freedom in your action.
Yeah.
But we all agree that there is a appropriate way to behave, and that appropriate way is to follow the dictates of God.
Reif puts it like the law codes were rooted in the will of God revealed in the Bible.
Yes.
So that formed the foundation of the very moral structure or framework.
So the first world is kind of fait accompli, but you don't buck the gods because they're the gods and you're not. Second world is you follow God because it's the appropriate and right thing to do, and that's where our morals come from. Third world is, well, we can get together and discuss whatever our morals are based on what we feel like. Do we think that it should be that this person should be put down, or maybe, we should extol the victims? Maybe not. Maybe the ends are the proper way of measuring people, not necessarily the means that they got to those ends.
Right. There is no sacredness.
There's no. It's internal again versus external. So you have a society or a nation who has certain values, who not merely looks within their society for their values, but really actually even shuns previous societies for the values of the present, which is wildly different than anything we've ever seen before. It is literally, we are bucking whatever religious or social constructs of the past were, because the unstated opinion is we're smarter, we're more enlightened, we're better than those ancient people of the past. Look at all the bad things that they did. And if they did those bad things, then we're not doing them, then obviously we're better. So therefore, everything that we believe is better.
I feel that, I mean, this is just my personal opinion. I'm not just, I feel that there might be a need to add a fourth world where these secular worlds behave like a religious world.
Well, let's talk about that later, because I think there are some experts in this area that are proposing for a fourth world. What would that look like, right? So remember the title of our show I came up with, Can We Resacralize a Third World Culture? To me, that's always intriguing. Can that happen? And we all agree that before things get any better, it will get worse first. And but again, we'll end with some of what Philip Reif calls as cracks in the third world culture. So he's writing this several generations ago, and he's already seeing the cracks. And I think a big crack today was overturning Roe v. Wade. The first and the second world cultures are very much, they're way closer than they are from the third world.
They're
extrinsic to the first and second.
Morality. That morality has an extrinsic authority. It's something outside of ourselves that everybody has to look and agree to.
The mimesis that we talked about during our last show.
We just have to make it up. The final arbiter is really ourselves. I know we're coming up on a station break pretty soon, but it's something that we should all think about. And I'm going to lift a quote from the book here by Carl Trueman here. And this is Philip Reif, and I'm going to Trueman quotes Reif here. Culture and sacred order are inseparable. The former, the registration of the latter as a systemic expression of the practical relation between humans and the shadow aspect of reality as it is lived. And this is where this is pretty strong, in my opinion, strong language here that Reif is using. He goes, no culture has ever preserved itself where it is not a registration of sacred order. There, cultures have not survived. The third culture notion of a culture that persists independent of all sacred orders is unprecedented in human history. That's kind of scary. So if the West is approaching total world culture, a third world culture status, do we have hope that this will survive? This, as we say, the great experiment of the U.S., right? Jacob, you and I were just talking about this on our drive up here, the great experiment, it's something to be admired and to be preserved. It's not perfect, but where else can you find anything close to this, right? And so these are sobering words from Philip Reif. By the way, Philip Reif, I believe, was not a Christian even.
I don't think so.
But he, toward the end, he became a fan of Christianity, and I think was convinced of some kind of deity. He might have been a monotheist at some point.
Yes. And we're seeing that today, right? So in popular figures like
Jordan Peterson,
Tom Holland.
Yes.
Even Douglas Murray. They are not, we don't even know if they're actual believers in God, but they are definitely fans of the Christian worldview and what it's done for society as they compare it to other societies in the past.
So I know in the last 90 seconds we have, I'm curious, and we will continue this discussion after our break. Do you guys think it's too strong by Rife to say this? What are your thoughts on that?
Well,
quote?
I think his last sentence is interesting because it says the third word notion of a culture that persists independent of all sacred orders is unprecedented in human history. I think that's true. I think we've never seen it because we are by nature sacred animals. Whether our sacred gene, our instinct is exercised through politics, and some people take politics to be the sacred aspect. More often than not now, it's their identity type thing. But it's always has a religious overtone now in all of it, because we need to have some kind of sacral aspect, something that is beyond question.
Something has to be beyond us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Even though there's an inherent contradiction in our society that these things are now our personal understanding. So they're beyond us, but they are us at the same time.
And this is also because culturally we have come to a place where we have not just rebelled against the idea of individualism, but also the individual. So there's longing to belong in some kind of identity group, collective, and find meaning through that.
Yes. Well, I think I hear the music, which signals a break. So if you're listening to apologetics.com radio right now, we have been discussing Chapter 2 of Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And we will be right back after a few messages.
All right, let's get back to the apologetics.com radio show.
Welcome back to the apologetics.com radio show. I am Harry Edwards, your host for this evening. This is the second half hour, and if you've been listening, we have been talking about Chapter 2 of Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It is something that we recommend highly because you will get a bird's eye view of what culture is going through right now. It'll help explain why you feel uneasy about today's values, why there are riots, why people are so confused about their own identity, their sexual identity, and so on and so forth. Just everything that is wrong right now with culture. Carl Trueman will help you understand what is going on here. So I think it's an important work. So we talked about Philip Rife's classification of different cultures. He calls it first world culture, second world culture, and third world culture. And I think the United States is headed toward that right now. Although, like I said, Philip Rife saw some breaks in that. Even back then when he was writing, I think, was the book published, I think, just before it was posthumously published, I think. And it's where he talks about the breaks in the death works, as he would call them. Let's just jump into that, gentlemen. Death works, what does Philip Rife mean by death works?
I'm quoting him here. He says, a death work can be anything that sets itself in opposition to the second world culture. Basically, the idea is the sacramental is made into the excremental.
Excremental.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not an abandonment of the tenets of faith. Mm-hmm. It's a degradation of them. It's calling them
look ridiculous,
evil and dirty,
yes,
and disgusting.
Yes. I think that follows, right? Wouldn't you say? If meaning is lost, then you must rebel against your existence, because perhaps you might find meaning in that, because nothing else makes sense to you. You have disassociated, you have unlinked yourself from the transcendent, from God. Then you're forced to look inward. Yeah, but then you find that you're just empty.
And when you actually distance yourself from the past, you become presentist. And I think that's a very clear reflection of our culture today. when we are agitated or we are frustrated with something that we witness outside that does not conform with our personal feeling and preferences, we tend to rebel and we want changes to happen immediately, here and now. We can dialogue maybe later, but it needs to be deconstructed here and now.
Well, and that's what so deconstruction is a trigger word.
Yes.
Right? Because we hear a lot of people who are deconstructing their Christianity. The reason why these kinds of things are so is because if you want to set up a new ethical framework, you need to collapse the old one. Trueman quotes McIntyre, notes that his idea of ethics that can exist only within some kind of a tradition. McIntyre makes this point that there's no absolute ethical standard that sits outside of, say, Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or whatever the tradition and understanding of the world is. So if you have a tradition, then you're going to have an ethical standard. And the communists have recognized this. This is why they've, in communist Russia and in China,
collective.
They bar religious, unless it's, supposedly sanctioned. But for the most part, they have political lessons over the week instead of religious. So it's you have to dismantle that in order to create a new tradition and a new, therefore, adopt the new ethical framework.
And the change comes through revolution, not reformation.
Right.
That's right. Hence, the explanation of the riots of 2 years ago.
Yeah.
That's exactly what they were doing. Yeah.
Right. But back to your DeathWorks idea, the problem with individualized, even collective society individualism, right? So if I'm part of a group and we all share a certain value, maybe Sierra Club or Greenpeace or whomever, you have certain ecological values, then you can start to say, well, maybe it is worth, the trees are just as valuable, or the PETA and the pigs can be set free in the city, or, whatever your modus operandi is, whatever your cause of the day may be, you exercise it with abandon because that's what's good for us. The problem is that those types of movements don't have any real ends in sight. They don't have a full-fledged picture of what the new society would look like. They only can point out what they don't like about the current society and destroy it. There is no picture of, well, what's the better construct? Because there is no construct. There is no here's how life works in my world,
And we were just talking about the whole idea of personhood, and I think that happens there as well.
Yeah.
In that, when we argue that there could be non-human persons, that we can extend personhood or confer personhood to other things, or what is connected with the whole idea of personhood to other things. I think in doing so, what we do is we end up annihilating the very idea of personhood. Yeah. If everything can qualify to be a person, then nothing qualifies to be a person.
That's true. In fact, to your point, Lenny, it's true what McIntyre's project was all about, that there's this quote here. Again, this is Trueman saying of McIntyre that actions can only be morally assessed only in terms of their ends.
Right.
And that's very Aristotelian. That's very Thomist, and
but not utilitarian.
No, not at all. Definitely not. In fact, he qualifies that here. Trueman does. You were mentioning there's a teleology to our actions. They serve a purpose.
Yeah.
And the other thing too is that it helps us to focus on the what is versus what ought to be.
Right.
So those are important things.
For example, Christianity has a long tradition of upholding the true, the good, and the beautiful. Right, the transcendentals. And what we find that God is the ultimate source of all truth. He's the ultimate understanding of all goodness, and is the ultimate exemplification of all beauty. So we see in God the perfections of these things to which we aspire. Therefore, as we draw closer to those goals, we also draw closer to the nature and image of God. We reflect his image as much as we can. That there is no image for the self-designated moralist, or the self-sourced moralist. And what's fascinating is that even today, what we're seeing is the system starts to break down simply because of this. So, Jacob, you had mentioned the different naming and removal of, say, statues. Now, I remember a few years ago when the Muslims were moving in through Afghanistan and different areas, they were blowing up Buddhist statues, and the historians and the archaeologists were coming off their chair. And many people in the West were saying, how can you remove these great ancient statues of 800 years ago? And then we turn around and we see a whole lot of people pulling down a whole lot of statues in the South and changing the names of schools, while homeless are running through their streets. And you start to say, well, how much different is this really?
Yeah, they're doing the same thing. Exactly.
But what are you putting up in its place? What is the goal?
Yeah.
And that's the difference between a revolution versus reformation.
Yeah.
Right. A revolution just seeks to destroy everything. And that's the death works.
And the Americans need to understand this, is that they entered into a process that required a kind of moral framework. And that was available until a few decades ago, right?
That's right.
And that framework has been dismantled in one sense. And in so doing, we have disrupted the whole process. And we are trying to actually recreate something out of thin air, basically. Because we can talk all about deconstruction, but what is it that we are constructing?
Right.
There is no discussion on that.
Yeah. Well, I wrote an article about, I said, watching the car crash of the college revolution, where, for years there was an idea, even in co-ed colleges, you had a boys' dorm and girls' dorm. There was an understanding that human beings are inherently flawed, that they will bend toward their appetites if given a chance, especially when they're young and foolish and think that they're invulnerable. And we have to police against that for their good as well as for the good of the society. There are certain things that we don't allow. In the sexual liberation revolution, those concerns were cast aside. And is it any surprise that you get the Me Too movement as a result of that? You can't have it both ways. You can't say, ollie, ollie, oxen free, we're going to have, sex experimentation week in college where we're going to show pornographic films, and think that that's not going to affect some percentage of the student population. It won't affect everybody, of course not. But there are the outliers. And so John Adams said, this nation will only work for a righteous and moral people. It just won't work for any other. And when you take that away, is it a surprise that you're seeing gun crime and mass shootings go up? No, because you always had that subset of the population, but that was suppressed by the cultural understanding of the day. You remove those guards, and those ends of the curve are always going to peak. It's just the way human beings work.
So with Carl Trueman's thesis here about, again, using McIntyre, Rife, and Taylor, and seeing where all of these things are all of these authors are pretty much saying the same thing. I like how he points out that McIntyre moved from using emotivism to expressionism or expressivism.
Expressivism,
That was insightful and good call by Trueman, because Taylor in his works, he's writing a little bit later, uses the term expressive individualism to describe our culture. So I thought that was a good insight from emotivism to expressionism from McIntyre, because it's not just sort of an inner feeling now. It's expressive. It's coming out now. And I do want to talk a little bit about. You hinted at it already. When we're removing the statues, we're rewriting history, but we're not replacing it with something that's good or true. And this is, by the way, right, different, you guys acknowledge, when it comes to the revisionist. We do acknowledge some of the missteps of maybe history writers. Let's say probably missing some details or not focusing on the bad parts of, let's say, U.S. history, like slavery. That's definitely a bad thing, a shameful thing in U.S. history. But that's certainly totally different than eradicating all of it.
Imagine if the authors of the Bible were doing the same thing.
Right.
Right? If we're
Nothing
just
would be
about
left of Scripture.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's a good example. Again, the difference between a revolution versus a reformation.
Well, that's you. So you get the language of critical theory, critical race theory, right? History is one long story of oppression. And when one holds such a view, the usefulness of history is not so much that it's a source of wisdom for the present, but it provides warning as to how people were exploited in the past. Therefore, we can't learn anything from history. Right. Therefore, we become anti-historical.
Right. And so that does not follow, again, the Marxist worldview of just everything is just under the grid of oppressors and the oppressed. Sure, that there are those classifications, but that's not all of history at all. Obvious things were how about here we can say for a period, right? The Nazis were the oppressors and the Jews were the oppressed. But that was a limited time in history. That's not how it is right now. So I think we get all messed up in our heads when we absolutize a lot of these ideas.
Or people.
And people, yeah. Since the overturning of Roe v. Wade is such a hot topic now, let's focus on that a little bit. So my thinking, if I'm going to apply McIntyre's and Taylor's idea of expressive individualism, we can make the connection that at one point in 1973, Roe wanted an abortion, and she said, I need it. I must have it. Why? Well, because I feel like I need to have it, right? And so just based really on that,
I think Jane Roe had already 2 or 3 children, and 2 children. She didn't want a third.
That's right.
But the Planned Parenthood, it was very much like the Scopes trial. It was, they purposely chose her to be the figurehead to take this all the way up to the Supreme Court. It was coordinated.
She never had
way.
Abortion.
No, she by the time it hit the Supreme Court, she had already delivered the child. So
she already did. Right.
So, but
she wanted one just out of convenience, right?
Yes.
And basically, that's her argument,
right?
And so that's a manifestation of a death work. Now, as opposed to, let's say, prior to all of this, that there was an acknowledgement of the providence of God and something transcendent beyond you that said you don't do this because that is a person that you're carrying. And it's kind of interesting, right? Because in most of life, we see anything that potentially becomes something as that thing itself. So we safeguard against eagle eggs, right? Like it's a federal offense to actually take one or destroy one, or I think even certain trees can't really be touched or harmed, right? I mean, because anything that is living will mature to its final state. And yet when it comes to babies in the womb, somehow that dodges that criteria.
I think we need to understand that personhood recognizes the potentiality, right? But it is not based on the exercise of the potential or potentiality.
Yeah.
That's what needs to keep in mind. If we actually disregard that, then we will look for persons with potentials.
Right.
Or potential persons.
And that's a good play on words. That's nice to remember. Is it a potential person or a person with potential?
Yeah.
So very, very different. And we talked about this, Jacob, last week, actually, really on this particular subject. And we can blame all sorts of thinking and historical eras on this, but essentially when you don't have a transcendent figure that says that this is sacred, this is not to be messed with, then of course you're left to your own devices. And so is it a blob of tissue? Is it whatever it is? But it can't be a person right now, apparently. It cannot be a person, because if it's a person, then murder is wrong. That's very clear. So now we apply all these arbitrary criteria to define what is inside the mother's womb. So that gives us all sorts of issues. Whereas, like you were saying in your project, Jacob, that it used to be a brute fact.
Yeah.
That a person is just a person, period, not to be messed with, right? Mm. There's no other criteria that's necessary. Because like you were saying, it is hard, in your research, it is hard to actually define what a person is. And yet we know intuitively what a person is.
Yeah, again, the thing is that the shift that happened, the epistemic shift that happened from personhood as foundational to foundations of personhood. Mm-hmm, the same kind of, right? So so when we took personhood as foundational, everything kind of like came out of that, right? In terms of how we understood human dignity, how we actually treated each other, how we treated the unborn. Whereas when we started looking for foundations of personhood, and personhood became based on the markers, certain external markers, that's where the question came: is the baby person or not?
Any one of you guys want to add to sort of the complexities, or what are some of the challenges that we face now? For instance, we are now on the side of history where Roe v. Wade has been overturned. It would be naive to think that there's going to be less abortions. In fact, I don't know, the states would divide over this now, and absolutely. Then certain states might be the place to get abortion and things like that.
Like California.
Who's
exactly. Pushing it.
But we were talking about this during the break, but right now, if you're a Christian, it's hard to align yourself with a particular political party. And I've been saying this for a while now with people I talk to about this. A certain political party actually advocates and encourages abortion. It's on their platform. And now that the discussion of abortion is at the forefront, I believe Christians ought to really do their homework in terms of how they understand this and where they side in this debate, in this dialogue.
Yeah.
I think it's not a gray area to say that murder is wrong. I think every Christian and anybody with a conscience knows that murder is wrong. And yet, maybe prior to Roe v. Wade or prior to this ruling, we have just swept it under the rug, type of a thing. It's become part of our culture, right?
Yeah, you can no longer hide under. There's no way we can change it.
It's not convenient anymore. Yeah, so maybe this is a good time for apologists.
It's interesting. It's one of those cracks that we talked about, or that we mentioned, that the idea that these third world ideologies, when your morality stems from yourself, there are signs that it becomes internally incoherent and unsupportable. So for example, look at all the rhetoric that's going around today about the abortion debate. How can you tell women not to, what to do with their body? All of a sudden we know what a woman is.
Yeah. Right. I know.
Wait a minute. Yeah. When did we get clarity on what the definition of a woman is, and that she's the individual who carries the child?
Time out. Wait a minute. You said women.
The same people who are advocating for pro-abortion are the ones who are saying you don't know what a woman is.
Right.
So here's a crack. Here's something that's going on.
That's good.
Here's another crack. The idea that sexual expression is central to identity, and it's when you start seeing the drag queen story hours at the local libraries or the elementary schools, parents are saying it's not that central. I don't want my kid to pick up on that primary. That's not the main thing he should be focusing on is his sexual predilections. That's not what we want as this driving factor for our children. The website Politico had a fascinating article just published about how there's so many internal debates and divisions within the left's own structures, that even nonprofits, left-leaning nonprofits, can't get anything done because some people want to be pure and they think that, you have to be pro-CRT and pro-abortion and they've got this whole checklist, and we can't have this person support us because he may be pro-abortion, but doggone it, he supports Elon Musk for buying Twitter or whatever the case may be. And they're fracturing and they're dividing within themselves because ultimately, if there's no extrinsic moral, then the societal morals start to disintegrate into individual moralities. Yeah. And everybody's got a different opinion. And so nobody can join with anybody else. It's been a fascinating thing to watch.
So that's actually hope. That's a hope we have. The cracks in the third world culture.
And I'll add one more crack.
Yeah.
I've heard time and again that they're good at telling stories.
Yeah.
But we need to know that stories with a myth as a foundation has a timeline.
Yeah, any story that's not true.
And we have the right kind of story with truth as its foundation, and truth prevails. And that must be our confidence as believers in Christ, knowing that what we have is valuable, that we are offering to people.
Absolutely.
Life matters, right? And it matters to the one who is living. Yeah. And for them to recognize that's the job that God has given to the church.
Yeah.
That's the job of every individual who trusts in the word of Jesus Christ.
So in some ways, this is an exciting time actually for apologists, for Christians, for the church, because we are seeing these massive cracks now. And we're not saying that it's politics where we rest our hope. No, it's in Christ. And but we live in this world, and He has told us to govern this world properly and to use our wisdom to do all of that. And but the secular age, we're seeing its foundations slowly crumble and slowly erode. This is going to be hard to get out of, for the left. Like you were saying, Lenny, now we're clear on what a woman is now, apparently. Yeah. No.
Go figure.
Wow. It all took a Supreme Court ruling.
And I will also say that we need to recognize this, that a Christian life is one like going up on a summit. We have the destination given to us.
Yes.
There are moments when we go downhill. We shouldn't be getting disappointed. But this seems like we are going up a little uphill towards the summit.
We had that opportunity.
Let's celebrate. Let's rejoice in that, but with the knowledge that we are in a battle.
Yeah, there's
Our battle is against the spiritual
lot of steep
forces.
grades ahead. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, back to the title of our discussion tonight. I asked the question: can we resacralize a third world culture? What are you guys' comments on that? Yes or no, and how?
I think God has, in the past, resacralized a very pagan Israel.
Yeah.
And God can do as God can do. That doesn't mean that there won't be pain in the interim, that there may not be judgment in the interim, but God can do that.
Yeah, and I'm hoping we see that in our lifetime, to be honest.
And I continue to trust that Christ is sitting at the right hand of God, and He has made us to sit with Him in the heavenly places.
Amen. Yes. So, all right. So you've been listening to apologetics.com radio, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. Our hope is that you've learned some aspect about the Christian worldview that strengthens your faith and make you want to learn more. So special thanks to my panel, Jacob and Lenny. Thanks to our engineer behind the scenes there that makes everything work. So special thank you to you, our listeners. So until next time, good night.